In 1961, two brothers signed a contract and walked away with $2.7 million. It should have been the happiest day of their lives. But as Ray Kroc left that room, he turned to his lawyer and said something that Richard and Maurice McDonald never heard. He said, "Now I'm going to get those sons of bitches." And he did. Today, there are 40,000 McDonald's restaurants in 100 countries, serving 70 million people every single day. The brothers who invented the name, the system, the concept, the golden arches, own none of it. Not one restaurant, not one share, not $1 of royalties. And the most disturbing part of this story is not what Ray Kroc did. It is that Richard and Maurice McDonald never saw it coming. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how two men built the most replicated business system in human history and ended up with almost nothing. And you're going to understand why the same thing could happen to anyone who builds something extraordinary and doesn't know the one rule that protects it. But to understand what happened in that room in 1961, you have to go back 20 years, to a parking lot in San Bernardino, California, to two brothers who had already failed at almost everything and were about to accidentally change the world. Richard and Maurice McDonald grew up poor in New Hampshire. Their father worked in a shoe factory. There was no money, no connections, no plan. And like millions of Americans in the 1930s, they drove west to California chasing something they couldn't quite name. They tried Hollywood first, carrying equipment, doing odd jobs, hoping that proximity to success would eventually become success itself. It didn't. Hollywood didn't want them. So in 1937, with almost nothing left, they opened a small hot dog stand near an airport. It barely worked, but here's the detail that everyone forgets about Richard and Maurice McDonald. They never quit. Not because they were optimists, because they were stubborn. And stubbornness, it turns out, is sometimes the only difference between the people who changed the world and the people who almost did. By 1940, they had saved enough to open a proper restaurant in San Bernardino. McDonald's bar beat Quebec 25 items on the menu. Car hops on roller skates serving food to cars. A drive-in that worked well enough to make money, but never quite well enough to make them rich. And every single day, the brothers watched their operation with the obsessive attention of men who know something is wrong even when everything appears to be going right. But wait, because what they noticed next, what they saw hiding inside their own business, is the insight that most people in their position would have missed completely. And it starts with a number. Actually, it starts with two numbers. Remember those two numbers, because they're the most important numbers in this entire story. And I will tell you exactly why in 3 minutes. The car hops were slow. The kitchen was chaotic. Food quality was inconsistent. And most of their revenue, they checked the numbers again and again because they couldn't quite believe it, came from just 3 items. Hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes. Everything else on the menu was noise. 22 items generating almost nothing. 3 items generating almost everything. Most restaurant owners would have looked at those numbers and done nothing. Richard and Maurice McDonald looked at those numbers and made a decision so radical that every person in the food industry who heard about it thought they had lost their minds. In 1948, they shut the restaurant for 3 days. They fired every single member of staff. They drew a completely new kitchen layout, not on paper, not on a whiteboard, in chalk, on a tennis court, because the tennis court was the only space big enough to draw it at full scale. They reduced the menu from 25 items to 9. They eliminated the car hops entirely, and they designed a system. They called it the Speedee service system, where every single item was made the same way, every single time, by workers who each had one specific job and did nothing else. The fry cook cooked fries. The burger assembler assembled burgers. Nobody crossed over. Nobody improvised. Nobody made a single decision. The system made all the decisions for them. And when they reopened, the cars lined up around the block within hours. Not because the food was extraordinary, because it was fast, cheap, and exactly what you expected. Every single time. 22 and 3. Those are the 2 numbers I told you to remember. 22 items that generated almost nothing. 3 items that generated almost everything. That ratio, that brutal, clarifying ratio, is what forced Richard McDonald to ask the question that changed everything. Not what should we add, but what should we destroy? Most people who build something spend their lives adding. The McDonald brothers understood that the most powerful thing you can do is subtract. Everything that did not serve the system had to go. Everything. Through the early 1950s, the brothers became locally famous. Journalists wrote about them. Other restaurant owners made pilgrimages to San Bernardino just to watch the kitchen operate. They were offered franchise deals constantly. They tried a few. But here is where something interesting happens. Something that most people telling this story get completely wrong. The brothers were not naive. They were not stupid. They understood exactly what they had built. But they had made a conscious decision, a deliberate, considered decision. That quality mattered more than scale. That one perfect restaurant was worth more than 100 imperfect ones. That decision was completely rational. It came from everything they had learned about business and quality and control. I want you to understand that, really understand it, because it matters for what comes next. That decision, the most rational decision they ever made, was the crack in the wall. And they had no idea. But before we get to the man who walked through that crack, and we're getting there, I promise, and what he said and did is going to be worse than you think. You need to understand the one thing that Richard and Maurice McDonald got completely wrong. Not about food, not about systems, about what they had actually built. They thought they were in the restaurant business. They were not. They were in the certainty business. And those are two completely different things. Think about what McDonald's actually sells. Not hamburgers, not fries. Think about the last time you walked into a McDonald's in a city you had never been to before, a city where you didn't speak the language, where nothing looked familiar, where every street felt slightly wrong. You didn't go because you were hungry for a hamburger. You went because you knew exactly what you were going to get. That certainty, that complete, total, absolute elimination of risk and surprise, is what they were really selling. In 1950s America, where people were moving from cities to suburbs, driving further distances, eating away from home for the first time in history, that promise was worth more than any meal any chef could ever cook. The brothers had accidentally invented something that had never existed before, a brand built entirely on the elimination of uncertainty. And they had no idea, because if they had known what they had really built, if they had understood that they were not selling hamburgers but selling the absence of fear, they would never have let Ray Kroc through the door. In 1954, a 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman from Illinois received an unusual order. A restaurant in San Bernardino had ordered 8 multi-mixer machines, enough to make 40 milkshakes simultaneously. Ray Kroc had been selling these machines for years. Nobody ever ordered 8. He got in his car and drove to California. And what he saw when he arrived stopped him cold. Not because the food was extraordinary, not because the restaurant was beautiful, because the line never ended. He stood in that parking lot for hours, counting customers, timing service, watching workers move with the precision of a machine. And somewhere in that parking lot, Ray Kroc had a vision that the brothers had never allowed themselves to have. He did not see a restaurant. He saw 10,000 restaurants. He saw every highway, every suburb, every corner of every city in America. He saw the world, and he understood, with a clarity that would have terrified Richard and Maurice McDonald if they could have read his mind, that the system was the product, and the system could be replicated forever. He approached the brothers. He was charming, persistent, persuasive. He told them he could take their system to the world. They were cautious, but they listened. And in 1954, Ray Kroc became the exclusive franchising agent for McDonald's. He was 52 years old. He had already lost his gallbladder and most of his thyroid. He was deeply in debt. He had spent 30 years chasing one failed idea after another. But he had just signed the agreement that would make him one of the wealthiest men who ever lived. And the brothers shook his hand and thought they had found a partner. They had not found a partner. They had opened the door. Now, remember the word I used at the beginning. Exactly. The word I said was the most important word in this entire story. Here's why. Richard and Maurice McDonald had built a system based on doing things exactly the same way every single time. That exactness was their genius. But when Ray Kroc began franchising their restaurants across America, he started making changes. Small ones at first, then larger ones. And every time the brothers pushed back, every time they said that is not exactly how we do it, Kroc had an answer. A legal answer. Because buried inside the contracts the brothers had signed were clauses that gave Kroc more control than they realized. And by the time they understood what those clauses meant, by the time they understood what they had actually signed, it was already too late. In 1961, Kroc made the brothers an offer. $2.7 million for the entire company. No royalties. No ongoing payments. A clean break. The brothers accepted. They were tired. They were cautious men who had never wanted an empire. They had wanted one perfect restaurant. And Kroc was offering them enough money to never worry again. So they signed. And as Kroc walked out of that room, he turned to his lawyer and said the words I told you about at the very beginning of this video. Now I'm going to get those sons of bitches. The crack in the wall the brothers had never seen, the rational decision that had blinded them to everything, had just cost them everything. The most disturbing part is not what Kroc said. It is that you can hear it coming from a moment he walked into that parking lot in San Bernardino. And they never could. Here is what Richard and Maurice McDonald leave every person who has ever built something with. The lesson that cost them everything. They understood that the system was more powerful than the product. They understood that consistency was more valuable than creativity. They understood that if you build something that works perfectly every single time, the world will come to you. All of that was right. All of that was genius. But they never answered the only question that ultimately matters when you build something extraordinary. How do you protect it from the people who see its value more clearly than you do? How do you make sure that what you build stays yours? Not because the law says so, not because the contract says so, but because you understood before anyone else arrived exactly what you had. They never found the answer. And the man who took it from them had known the answer his entire life. Ray Kroc didn't invent the hamburger. He didn't invent fast food. He didn't even invent the system. What he invented was the hunger, the absolute, consuming, relentless hunger to take something perfect and scale it across the face of the earth before its creators understood what it was worth. That hunger is not admirable. It is not something to celebrate. But it is something every person who builds anything needs to understand exists and is coming for what they love most. In 1961, Ray Kroc left that room and said words that the brothers never heard. Now you know what those words really meant. And now you know what it cost. Not just $2.7 million. Not just a company. Everything they had ever built, drawn in chalk on a tennis court, assembled line by line, item by item, decision by decision, handed over to a man who had been planning to take it from the moment he saw the line that never ended. What Ray Kroc did next is the part of the McDonald's story that no business school teaches. It involves a real estate company disguised as a food company, a contract that franchisees are still paying for today, and a legal maneuver so precise that it turned a hamburger stand into the most valuable property empire in American history. And it will change the way you see every business you have ever admired, because none of them are selling what you think they are selling. Subscribe. Part 2 is coming.